Steady hospital monitor beeping. Savannah drops a folder onto the hospital bed. Voice cold as ice. Sign it. Daniel is done with you. You are holding him in a marriage he does not want with a pregnancy he never planned. Claire, hands trembling, eyes wide, staring at the divorce papers. How? How did you get in here? Savannah smiles. Slowly, Daniel called the hospital ahead. The monitor shifts from beeping to a single, long tone. Flatline. Nurses rush in. Chaos. Carol blocks herself between the two, voice low, every word like a nail being driven. You are done. Get out of here. Cut. William Harrington steps into the hospital room, loosening his tie, face hardened. William sits down, looks straight at Claire. My son has been using your identity to borrow $900,000 for the past 14 months. And this is not the first time he has done this. Silence. Claire looks down at a wedding photo of another woman standing next to Daniel. A husband who forged his wife's signature before he even proposed. A mistress planted inside a hospital room. And a billionaire father who decided to expose everything, including his own son. The full story is right after this. Listen until the end, and you will understand why this woman nearly lost everything, and how she took it all back. The beeping stopped. That is what I remember most clearly about the moment my life broke open. Not the pain shooting through my lower back. Not the way the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Not even the sharp chemical smell of the hospital room that had become my entire world for the past 3 days. The beeping stopped. If you have never been in a hospital bed, connected to a heart monitor, let me explain what that sound means to you. It becomes your heartbeat's echo. A steady, rhythmic confirmation that you are still here, that your body is still doing the work it was designed to do, that the baby inside you is still holding on. You stop hearing it after a while, the way you stop hearing your own breathing. It fades into the background of your awareness, a quiet promise repeated over and over, until it stops. And when it stops, the silence is not silent at all. It is replaced by a single, screaming tone, a flatline, a sound that exists for one purpose and one purpose only, to tell every person within earshot that something has gone terribly wrong. The nurse's face went white. I remember that. A woman in her 50s with steady hands and kind eyes. And in that moment, her composure cracked like thin ice on a winter pond. She moved fast. Faster than I thought a person her age could move. Her fingers found buttons and switches, and she was calling out codes and numbers that meant nothing to me and everything to the people who came running. I was 34 weeks pregnant. I was alone. And 30 seconds before that monitor flatlined, a woman I had met exactly once had walked into my hospital room wearing my husband's favorite perfume and dropped divorce papers on my lap. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is not where this story begins. That is the middle. The explosive, world-ending middle that I spent the next 8 months trying to survive. And I want to tell you all of it. Every piece. Not because I want your sympathy, though I will not pretend it does not feel good to be believed. I want to tell you because somewhere out there, right now, tonight, a woman is sitting in a beautiful house that does not feel like hers, married to a man whose smile does not reach his eyes. And she is telling herself the same lie I told myself for 4 years. She is telling herself it is not that bad. She is telling herself she is imagining things. She is telling herself that love is supposed to feel like this, like a slow, careful erasure of everything she used to be. My name is Claire Harrington, and the man who tried to destroy me, the man who forged my signature, stole my identity, and sent his mistress to my hospital room to pressure me into signing away my rights while I was on bed rest with a high-risk pregnancy. That man almost succeeded. 3 separate times. He nearly won. This is how I survived all 3. Let me take you back to the beginning, not the beginning of the marriage. Before that, I need you to understand who I was before Daniel Harrington, because you need to see the shape of the person who was slowly, deliberately erased. You need to see what was there so you can understand what it meant when it was gone. I was a 6th grade English teacher in Charlotte, North Carolina, 31 years old. I lived in a studio apartment on the 2nd floor of an old building with hardwood floors that creaked in the winter and a kitchen window that faced east, so I got morning light while I made coffee. I drove a used Honda Civic that I had named Gerald because the engine made a grumbling sound when I started it on cold mornings, like an old man being woken up too early. I had student loans that I paid on time. I had a savings account with about $3,000 in it. Money I had been setting aside since college for reasons I could never quite define. Emergency money, just-in-case money, the kind of cushion that feels insignificant until it is all you have left. I coached the school debate team on Thursday afternoons. I made my own pasta on Sunday evenings. I called my mother, Sandra, every Wednesday night, and we would talk for an hour about nothing in particular. The weather, a book she was reading, whether Mrs. Patterson next door had finally fixed her fence. I was happy. Happy in the uncomplicated way you are happy when you do not yet know what you are missing. Happy in the way that does not make for a good story, but makes for a very good life. Then I met Daniel Harrington. It was a fundraiser for the school district. One of those events where people who have too much money sit in a ballroom and feel generous for a few hours, while teachers stand along the walls in their best clothes and try to look grateful. I was there because my principal had asked me to attend. I was standing near the dessert table, eating a petit four that was too sweet, when a man in a charcoal suit walked over and asked me what I thought of the cheesecake. I told him I had not tried it yet, he said, and I remember his exact words. "You should. It is the only honest thing on this table." I laughed. He smiled. And that was how it started. Daniel Harrington bought our entire table that night, $50,000. He wrote the check while talking to me about John Steinbeck. Not the surface-level Steinbeck that people reference at dinner parties to sound well-read. He had actually read the books. He quoted a passage from East of Eden that I had underlined in my own copy at home. A passage about the human capacity for choosing goodness, even in the face of everything that argues against it. I thought it was fate. I thought the universe had placed this man in my path because we were meant to find each other. I thought the fact that he had read my favorite book and underlined the same passages meant something cosmic. I know what you are thinking, and you are right. But here is what I need you to understand about that night, about that version of me standing in a ballroom with petit four crumbs on her fingers and a man quoting Steinbeck in her ear. I was not naive. I was not desperate. I was not some lonely woman waiting to be rescued. I was a woman who had built a life she was proud of. And when someone showed up who seemed to see the best parts of that life and want to be part of it, she said yes. That is not a flaw. That is being human. The flaw came later. The flaw was not in trusting. The flaw was in continuing to trust long after the evidence told me to stop. Daniel was 42, 11 years older. He was the kind of handsome that photographs well but looks even better in person. The kind of face that rearranges itself depending on the light. So you keep looking because you think you might have missed something. He was the son of William Harrington. The William Harrington, real estate developer, Forbes list, the man who had literally built half of Charlotte's skyline. Daniel ran his own tech consulting firm, successful, established. He drove a car that cost more than my annual salary, and he never once mentioned the price, which I took as a sign of character rather than strategy. He texted back within minutes. He remembered things I mentioned in passing, the name of my favorite coffee shop, the fact that I preferred garden roses to long stems, the title of the book I was teaching that semester. He showed up to my classroom's winter recital with flowers. He sat in a tiny chair designed for an 11-year-old and clapped for every single student like they were performing at Carnegie Hall. And he said, looking at me across a room full of children and construction paper decorations, "I have been waiting to meet someone who actually cares about something." We dated for 8 months. He proposed on the rooftop of the restaurant where we had our first date. String quartet, my favorite flowers, garden roses, the real ones. Not the grocery store kind. He had called my mother to ask her permission first. Sandra cried happy tears when I told her. I said yes before he finished the sentence. "I need to tell you about the wedding. And I need to be honest about it. Because I spent a long time pretending it was something it was not. The wedding was not mine. 300 guests. I knew 40 of them. The venue was a converted estate outside Charlotte, surrounded by magnolia trees and manicured gardens that looked beautiful in photographs and felt, in person, like a museum. Everything was arranged for display, not for living. I had never seen the venue before Daniel's mother, Margaret Harrington, emailed me the booking confirmation. Margaret, let me describe Margaret, because she is essential to understanding the architecture I walked into. Margaret Harrington had been married to William for 38 years. She was 64, elegant in the way that old money women are elegant. Not flashy, not attention-seeking, but precise. Every detail controlled. Her hair, her jewelry, her posture, her words. She moved through rooms the way water moves through a pipe, following the path of least resistance, while quietly wearing down everything it touches. Margaret never told me what to do. That is important. She never issued commands. She never raised her voice or made demands. She simply had strong opinions about the venue, about the flowers, about the dress, about the guest list, about the seating arrangement, the rehearsal dinner menu, the font on the invitations, the music during the ceremony, the color of the napkins. And Daniel always agreed with her. Always. If I suggested something different, there was never an argument. There was simply a conversation, a very reasonable, very patient conversation in which Daniel would explain why his mother's suggestion made more sense, was more appropriate for the occasion, better reflected the family's standards. And then he would smile and say, "But of course it is your day. Whatever you want. Whatever you want," said in a tone that made it clear that what I wanted was wrong. I told myself this was love. A son who respected his mother. A family that valued tradition. A culture I was not yet accustomed to but would grow into with time. I told myself a lot of things during those engagement months. I became very good at telling myself things. The wedding itself was beautiful. Everyone said so. The photographs were stunning. I looked happy in every single one because I had learned how to arrange my face into the right expression. But there was one moment. I was standing at the bar during the reception. My dress was slightly too tight across the shoulders because Margaret had insisted on a different designer than the one I had chosen. And this designer cut for a narrower frame. I was uncomfortable, and I was trying not to show it, and I was watching Daniel across the room. He was laughing with his father's business associates. Easy, confident laughter. The kind of laugh that fills a room and makes people lean in. He was charming them the way he had charmed me, with attention and wit and the suggestion that you were the most interesting person he had spoken to all evening. And then he glanced over at me. Just a glance. Half a second. Maybe less. But I saw it. I saw what was behind his eyes in that half second before he rearranged his expression. Assessment, not affection. He was checking whether I was performing correctly, whether I was standing in the right place, talking to the right people, wearing the right smile. He was scanning me the way a director scans an actress during a dress rehearsal, checking for mistakes. I looked away. I picked up my champagne glass. I took a long sip and told myself I was nervous. Told myself I was reading too much into a glance. Told myself that this was my wedding day and I was supposed to be happy, and the feeling in my stomach was excitement, not dread. That look, that assessing, calculating, measuring look, I would see it 10,000 more times over the next 4 years. And every single time, I would convince myself I was imagining it. I want to pause here. I want to step outside the story for a moment and speak directly to you. If you are watching this and something in you recognized that look, that moment of being assessed instead of seen, measured instead of loved, I want you to hear what I am about to say very carefully. Trust that recognition, not the explanation you give it afterward, not the story you tell yourself about why it is fine, why he is just stressed, why you are being too sensitive. Trust the first instinct, the one that fires before your rational mind has time to talk you out of it. Your nervous system knows the difference between someone checking on you and someone checking up on you. It knows the difference between a man who looks at you with warmth and a man who looks at you with evaluation. Your body has been reading other people's intentions since before you had language to describe them. I did not listen to mine, and I want you to learn from that faster than I did. After the wedding, life settled into a pattern. Daniel's pattern, not mine, his. We moved into his house, a beautiful house in a beautiful neighborhood with beautiful furniture I had not chosen. He introduced me to his world, and his world was very specific. The right restaurants, the right clubs, the right charity boards, the right conversations with the right people about the right topics. And slowly, so slowly that I did not feel it happening, my world disappeared. I quit teaching 6 months after the wedding. Daniel did not demand it. That is important to understand, because when people hear this part of the story, they often picture a man pounding his fist on a table and forbidding his wife from working. Daniel never did that. He was too smart for that, too careful. Instead, he made things difficult. He scheduled dinner parties on school nights and then expressed disappointment when I was too tired to be present. He mentioned, casually, that his colleagues' wives found it unusual that I was still working. He asked, gently, always gently, whether I was really fulfilled in a classroom when I could be doing something more meaningful with my position. My position, as if being Mrs. Daniel Harrington was a title that came with responsibilities and obligations. A job in itself that required my full attention. And here is the thing about being slowly reshaped. You do not notice the shape you are losing. You are too busy trying to fit the new one. Each individual change feels small, reasonable, even logical. It is only when you step back and look at the whole picture that you realize you have been carved into someone else's design. I stopped teaching. I attended the right events. I learned which fork was for the salad course. I made friends with the wives Daniel approved of. Pleasant, careful women who had learned the same performance I was learning. I let go of my apartment, my book club, my Thursday debate team. I let go of Sandra's weekly phone calls. That one I should have caught. Daniel suggested, very gently, that I was emotionally dependent on my mother in a way that was not healthy for our marriage. That calling her every week was a sign of an attachment that I needed to outgrow. He framed it as growth, as maturity, as the natural evolution of a woman who was building her own family and needed to establish healthy boundaries with her family of origin. I reduced the calls to once a month, then once every 6 weeks. Sandra never said anything about it. She just answered whenever I called, the same way she always had, with the same warmth, the same patience, the same quiet love that never demanded anything in return. I think about that now and it makes me want to weep. The grace of a mother who watched her daughter disappear and kept the porch light on anyway. The isolation was so gradual it felt like maturity, like I was shedding the old life, the small life, to build something more significant. That is how it is sold to you. Evolution. Upgrade. You do not realize until you look around one day and every single person who knew you before is gone. And the person standing in their place has your name but not your voice. 22 months into our marriage, I got pregnant. Daniel was thrilled, performatively, visibly thrilled. He announced it at his father's birthday dinner before I had told my own mother. He bought a crib the next day and had it assembled in the room he had already chosen, the room down the hall from his study, the room with the view of the backyard, without asking me whether I had a preference. He called the baby his heir at least 4 times in the first week. Not his child, his heir. I told myself that was just how old money families spoke. That legacy and lineage and inheritance were part of a vocabulary I had not grown up with but was learning. I told myself his excitement was genuine even if his language was strange. I told myself a lot of things. But I noticed something else. Around the same time, the same week actually, a woman named Savannah Cole joined Daniel's firm as a strategic communications consultant. I met her once at a company dinner. She was 34, beautiful in a very deliberate way. The kind of beauty that requires investment and maintenance and constant attention. She had auburn hair and she wore a perfume that smelled like jasmine and vanilla and something darker underneath, something warm and expensive. She spoke to Daniel with the easy familiarity of people who have already established where the lines are. Or, more accurately, people who have already crossed them and are comfortable on the other side. I asked Daniel about her on the drive home. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands at 10 and 2 and he said, "She is good at her job. Do not read into things. Claire, pregnancy makes women hypervigilant." I apologized. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I apologized to him for noticing, for trusting my instincts, for observing something that was right in front of my face and having the audacity to mention it out loud. He accepted my apology graciously, the way he accepted everything, with a slight nod and a hand on my knee and a tone that suggested I had just demonstrated exactly the kind of emotional instability he had been concerned about. The pregnancy continued. My body changed. My world shrank further. I stopped going to events because my feet were swollen and my back hurt, and Daniel said he understood completely and went to them alone. I stopped seeing the wives because scheduling became complicated, and Daniel's schedule was the priority. I spent my days in that beautiful house with the furniture I had not chosen, watching my body grow around a baby I loved more than anything I had ever loved, and feeling, underneath the love, a loneliness so profound it had its own gravity. At 7 months, my doctor ordered bed rest. My blood pressure was dangerously high. She used the word stroke, and I nodded like she was describing someone else's body, someone else's risk, someone else's baby. Daniel drove me to the hospital himself. He carried my bag. He kissed my forehead before he left for what he called an emergency investor call. I watched him walk out of my hospital room, and I noticed 2 things. His shoulders were tense, not worried tense, agitated tense. The tension of a man whose plan has been disrupted. And his phone. It buzzed 17 times before we reached the parking garage. 17 times. I counted because counting gave me something to do other than wonder who was sending all those messages. He never let me see the screen. I lay in that hospital bed, hooked to monitors and IV drips, and I placed both hands on my stomach and felt my baby kick. And I thought, very clearly, something is wrong. Not with the baby, not with my blood pressure. Something is wrong with my life. And then I pushed the thought away, the way I had pushed away every inconvenient thought for the past 2 years. And I closed my eyes and waited for Daniel to come back. He did not come back that night. He called at 9:30 and said the meetings had run late and he would be there first thing in the morning. His voice was tired, distracted. In the background I could hear music, faintly, and the clink of glasses. I said I understood. I hung up. I lay in the dark and listened to the beeping of the heart monitor and tried to count the ways I had been telling myself everything was fine. I lost count somewhere around 40. I was alone in the room for 3 hours the next afternoon. I had been drifting in and out of sleep, the way you do in hospitals. Never quite awake and never quite resting. The medication made everything soft around the edges. The light through the window had shifted from bright to golden to the pale gray of late afternoon. A nurse had come and gone. Vitals checked. Notes made. The quiet efficiency of people who are paid to keep you alive. When the door opened again, I assumed it was another nurse. Another blood pressure check. Another concerned look at the numbers on the screen. I did not open my eyes immediately. Then I smelled her perfume. Jasmine and vanilla and something darker underneath. The same perfume I had noticed on Daniel's jacket 3 weeks earlier. The same scent I had pressed my face into when I picked up his dry cleaning. Standing in our closet, breathing it in. Telling myself it was a client's perfume that had transferred during a handshake. Nothing more. I opened my eyes. Savannah Cole was standing at the foot of my hospital bed. She was wearing a navy dress, designer bag on her arm, heels that clicked against the linoleum floor like punctuation marks, sharp and deliberate. Her hair was pulled back. Her makeup was perfect. She looked like a woman who had somewhere important to be and considered this a brief stop along the way. She looked at me the way people look at furniture they are about to rearrange. "You need to sign these," she said, and she dropped a folder on my lap. I looked down. My hands were shaking. I do not know if it was the medication or the fear or the sudden understanding that crashed over me like a wave. But my hands were shaking and I could not make them stop. I opened the folder. Divorce papers. Savannah did not sit down. She stood at the foot of my bed and she looked at me with an expression that was not cruel, exactly, but was entirely absent of any recognition that I was a person. To her, I was an obstacle, a problem to be solved, an item on a checklist. "Daniel is done," she said. "You have been holding him in a marriage he does not want with a pregnancy he did not plan. Stop making this harder than it needs to be." I stared at her. I tried to form words. My mouth was dry. The monitor beside me had begun to beep faster. "How did you get in here?" I said. This was a locked ward, restricted access. You needed a wristband or a nurse's clearance or a patient's authorization to get past the front desk. I was in a high-risk maternity unit. Security existed for a reason. Savannah smiled. It was a small smile. "Practiced." "Daniel called ahead," she said. The world went sideways. Not metaphorically. The room actually tilted. The edges of my vision went dark and then bright and then dark again. I reached for the call button on the side rail, but my fingers were numb, and the button was small, and Savannah was moving. Not toward the button, but past me. Reaching for the IV stand. Getting closer. And in the movement, the needle in my arm shifted, and the pain was sharp and sudden, and the monitor started screaming. Not beeping. Screaming. That single, flatline tone I described at the beginning of this story. The sound that means everything is going wrong at once. Nurses came running. 2 of them. Then 3. Savannah was shouting something about having rights, about Daniel authorizing her visit, about legal documents that needed to be signed. Her voice was loud and sharp, and it filled the room the way smoke fills a room, choking out everything else. I pressed both hands against my stomach. I was crying. I do not remember deciding to cry. The tears were just there, hot on my face, and my hands were on my belly, and I was pressing, trying to feel my baby move. "Please," I whispered. "Please move. Please." Nothing. 3 seconds of nothing that lasted 300 years. Then a kick. Small. Fierce. Angry. Almost. My daughter kicked so hard I gasped. She moved. A nurse named Carol. 50-something. No nonsense. With the kind of face that has handled every emergency imaginable and has no patience left for anything that is not the immediate priority, planted herself between me and Savannah. She was not a large woman, but she filled the space completely. She put her hand on Savannah's shoulder and she said, very quietly, in a voice that left no room for negotiation, "You are done here." Security removed Savannah from the building 7 minutes later. The baby's heartbeat was irregular for 11 minutes. 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall with a concentration so intense that the numbers burned themselves into my memory. Each minute was a year. Each year was a lifetime. 11 lifetimes of lying in that bed, hands on my stomach, praying to a God I had not spoken to in years, making promises I meant with every cell in my body. At minute 12, the heartbeat stabilized. Carol held my hand and said, "She is a fighter. Your girl." I nodded. I could not speak. Carol looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "Whoever sent that woman in here, you need to understand something. That was not a visit. That was an attack." I understood. For the first time in 4 years, I understood exactly what was happening to me, and I could not explain it away. I could not reframe it. I could not tell myself it was a misunderstanding or a miscommunication or a moment of poor judgment. My husband had sent his mistress to my hospital room while I was on bed rest with a high-risk pregnancy to pressure me into signing divorce papers. He had called ahead. He had given her my room number. He had bypassed the security that existed to protect me and my unborn child. That was not love gone wrong. That was calculation. And whatever happened next, I was done pretending otherwise. William Harrington arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after the attack. I want to be careful about how I describe William, because it would be easy to make him the hero of this story. He is not. He is a man who spent 40 years building an empire, and about 38 of those years looking the other way when it came to the things his empire cost other people. He had money and power and influence, and he had used all three to build a world that ran according to his specifications. He was not innocent. He was not blameless. And the fact that he helped me does not erase the years he spent, helping create the conditions that made my suffering possible. But in that hospital room, on that afternoon, William Harrington was something I had not encountered in a very long time. He was honest. He walked in without knocking. He was wearing a suit, but his tie was loosened and his hair was slightly out of place, which for William was the equivalent of another man being completely disheveled. He looked at me, IV in my arm, eyes swollen, both hands on my stomach, hospital gown wrinkled and stained with tears. His face did something complicated. Not pity, something older than pity. Something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing, in my hospital bed, the consequences of something he had been trying very hard not to see. "Tell me what happened," he said. So I told him everything. From the beginning, the isolation, the reshaping, the way Daniel had slowly, methodically cut me off from every person and every resource and every piece of my identity until I was entirely dependent on him. The perfume on his jacket, Savannah at the company dinner, the phone calls he took in the other room, and today, the divorce papers, the room number, the flat line. William listened without interrupting. He sat in the plastic chair beside my bed, the most expensive suit in the hospital folded into a chair designed for someone half his status, and he listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. His hands were clasped. He was looking at the floor. Then he said, "I have been having Daniel's company audited for 3 months. I did not tell you because I was not sure yet. I am sure now." I did not understand what he meant. Not yet. He looked up at me. His eyes were tired. Not the tiredness of a sleepless night, the tiredness of a man who has spent decades building something and has just realized that part of what he built is rotten. William called his personal attorney within the hour, a woman named Grace Whitfield, former federal prosecutor, the kind of lawyer who does not raise her voice because she does not need to. She had spent 20 years in courtrooms dismantling arguments the way surgeons dismantle tumors, with precision and patience and the absolute certainty that what she was removing needed to go. Grace arrived at the hospital that evening with a briefcase and an expression that suggested she had seen worse, but not by much. And then William said something I will never forget. He said, "My son has been using your identity to borrow money for at least 14 months. You are currently listed as personally liable for $900,000 in debt you did not know existed." The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight, the kind of quiet that presses down on your chest and makes breathing feel like a conscious decision. $900,000 in my name, using my social security number, my credit history, my signature. 14 months of loans and credit lines and financial instruments I had never seen, never signed, never authorized. "I need you to understand something, Claire," William continued. His voice was low, measured, the voice of a man choosing his words with extreme care. "What is happening to you is not a divorce. It is a dismantling, and it started before the wedding." I stared at him. "Before the wedding," I repeated. William nodded. "Before he proposed." William did not answer, but his silence was an answer. Grace Whitfield opened her briefcase and placed a document on the table beside my hospital bed. A prenuptial agreement, dated 2 weeks before our wedding. My signature at the bottom. "Have you seen this before?" she asked. "No," I said. "That is what I expected." She pulled out a second sheet, a forensic handwriting analysis, already completed. "The signature is forged. Extremely well done. But the pressure points are wrong. The pen angle is consistent throughout. Real signatures vary. Someone studied your handwriting carefully and replicated it." I stared at my own name written in someone else's version of my hand. My name. My letters, but not my hand. Not my intent. Not my consent. "How long has he been planning this?" I asked. Grace looked at me steadily. "The prenup is dated 14 months before your wedding, which means he began planning the exit strategy before he proposed." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. He proposed to me with an exit strategy already in his pocket. The string quartet, the garden roses, the call to my mother, the Steinbeck quotes, the winter recital, the tiny chair in my classroom, all of it. Every moment I had cherished, every memory I had held close during the hard years that followed. Every piece of evidence I had used to convince myself that underneath the assessment and the control and the isolation there was real love. All of it was a performance designed to make me sign my life away without knowing I was signing anything at all. 3 days after the attack, Grace Whitfield filed criminal charges: fraud, forgery, identity theft. She moved with the speed and precision of someone who had been waiting for a case like this. Someone whose entire career had been building toward the moment when all of her skills could be deployed on behalf of a person who genuinely needed them. Savannah Cole had already been arrested. Her testimony, offered in exchange for reduced charges, confirmed everything. Daniel had given her the room number, had told her exactly what to say, had promised her that once I was handled, his word, handled, they would be together. William froze Daniel's company accounts. His investors pulled out. His board voted him out within 72 hours. The judge handling our emergency custody hearing denied Daniel any visitation rights pending criminal investigation. No contact, no visits, no phone calls, nothing. I was moved to a private room. Security on the door. A man named Owen, William's personal security, was stationed outside 24 hours a day. He was quiet and solid, and he nodded at me once when he took his position, and that nod meant more to me than 1,000 words of reassurance. Sandra flew in from Raleigh, my mother, the woman I had been slowly pushed away from for 4 years. She walked into my hospital room, and she looked at me, and she did not say, "I told you so." She did not say I knew something was wrong. She did not say any of the things she had every right to say. She sat down beside me, and she took my hand, and she said, "I am here now." We ate hospital food and cried and laughed, and I thought, it is over, we won. He is done. I actually said those words to Sandra. I sat in my hospital bed with my mother beside me and my baby safe inside me, and Grace Whitfield's criminal charges filed and William's accounts frozen, and I said, "I think we are going to be okay." Sandra squeezed my hand. "I think so too, baby. We were both wrong." I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the part of the story where things get worse. And before they do, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me. When you are in the middle of something terrible and you finally see a break, finally feel the weight lift, finally allow yourself to believe that the worst is over, that moment of relief is real and it matters. Even if the worst is not actually over, even if there are more blows coming, that moment when you breathe, when you let your shoulders drop, when you allow yourself to hope, that moment is not naive. It is survival. Your body is giving you a rest because it knows you need one. Do not be ashamed of hoping too soon. The hope kept you alive long enough to get to the next chapter. And there is always a next chapter. 4 days after I thought we had won, Grace Whitfield called me at 7 in the morning. Her voice was controlled, carefully, deliberately controlled, in the way that people control their voices when the news is very bad, and they are trying to deliver it without making it worse than it already is. "Claire," she said, "I need you to prepare yourself. Daniel's legal team has filed a counter-motion. They have submitted a psychiatric evaluation, not the one scheduled for next Tuesday. A different one, conducted 6 weeks ago by a doctor named Franklin Moore. I have never seen Dr. Moore in my life." I said. "I know," Grace said. "The evaluation was conducted using medical records obtained from your OB and statements from." She paused. "Claire, the statements are from your neighbors, your housekeeper, 2 women from the charity committee you were on. What do the statements say?" I asked. Another pause. "Longer this time. That you have been erratic," Grace said, "emotionally unstable. That you have shown signs of paranoid ideation during your pregnancy. That you accused Daniel of infidelity without evidence and created a hostile environment in the home. The housekeeper, Betty, a woman I had been kind to for 3 years, who I had given Christmas bonuses to, who I had sat with in the kitchen on slow mornings while she drank coffee and told me about her grandchildren. Betty, who had watched me shrink inside that house, who had seen me crying in the bathroom more than once, who had heard Daniel's voice shift when he spoke to me behind closed doors. Daniel had gotten to her. I did not know how. Money, pressure, fear, maybe all three. But he had gotten to her, and she had signed a statement saying I was unstable, and that statement was now part of the official record. "Can we fight it?" I asked. Grace said. "But Claire, there is something else. There was always something else. The fraud charges. Daniel's attorney is arguing that the signatures, while irregular, could be explained by your own inconsistency. That your handwriting changed during pregnancy due to stress. They have hired their own handwriting expert. I could not speak. The words were there, in my head, but they could not find their way to my mouth." "I know," Grace said, reading my silence. "But it creates reasonable doubt. And with the psychiatric evaluation now in the record, they have a narrative. Not a true one, but a narrative." She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. They were not just defending Daniel. They were systematically dismantling my credibility. Every piece of evidence we had, every fact, every document, every testimony. They were building a counter-narrative around a single, devastating idea that I was too unstable to be believed. Sandra arrived at 9 that morning. She brought coffee and a change of clothes in the calm, determined energy of a woman who has survived hard things before and knows what it takes to survive them again. At 9:47, Daniel appeared in the hallway outside my room. He could not get past security. Owen was stationed at the door, solid and unmovable. But Daniel stood at the end of the corridor, 30 feet from my room, and he looked at me through the narrow window in the door. I could see his face. He was not angry. He was not desperate. He was calm, the composed, measured calm of a man executing a plan. He held up his phone. A text arrived on my phone 30 seconds later, from a number I did not recognize. Drop the charges or I release the photos. I stared at the screen. I did not know what photos. And that, I realized, was the entire point. The threat was not about the photos. The threat was about the not knowing. Because the imagination is always crueler than reality. Whatever Daniel had or did not have, the fact that I did not know meant that every possibility was alive. Every embarrassing moment, every private conversation, every vulnerable instant from 4 years of marriage could be the thing he was holding over me. I showed the text to Grace Whitfield when she arrived. "He is bluffing," she said. "Probably. Probably," I repeated. Grace sat down beside me and she spoke carefully and directly. "Claire, listen to me. This is what desperate men do. They find the thing you are most afraid of and they hold it up, even if they do not have it. Because fear is cheaper than evidence. But I was afraid. I was 7.5 months pregnant, lying in a hospital bed, and the man I had trusted with my entire life was standing 30 feet away with my room number and my forged signature and my housekeeper's testimony, and the word probably hanging in the air between us. And I had nothing. No income, no job, no friends he had not screened, no apartment. Nothing in my own name except my mother's phone number and $3,000 in a savings account I had been keeping since college. That just-in-case money. That money I had never been able to define a purpose for. I understood its purpose now. That was my lowest point. Not the attack, not the forgery, not the flatline or the fear or the forged prenup. That hallway, that text, that probably. It was the moment when I realized that everything I had built, everything I had been, everything I thought was mine, had been taken so completely that I was lying in a hospital bed with nothing to fight with except my mother and $3,000 and the truth. And the truth, without power behind it, felt like nothing at all. Sandra sat beside me and did not say anything for a long time. She held my hand and she let the silence do what silence does. Hold the space until the person in it is ready to fill it. Then she said, "You know what I did when your father left us." I shook my head. "I made a list," she said. "Not of everything that was wrong. Not of everything I had lost. A list of the next 3 things I needed to do. Just 3. That is it. You cannot fight an entire war at once. Claire, you fight the next 3 feet." She looked at me. Her eyes were steady. "What are your next 3 feet?" I lay there for a long time, thinking, feeling the baby move inside me, listening to the monitor beep. Then I said, 1. Save the text message. Forward it to Grace. Document everything. 2. Do not respond. Do not give him the reaction he needs. 3. Find out what he actually has, because probably is not good enough to give up. Sandra nodded. "That is my girl," she said. And for the first time since Daniel appeared in that hallway, I felt something other than fear. I felt angry, not the wild, uncontrolled anger that burns itself out. The quiet kind. The kind that settles into your bones and hardens there. The kind that does not scream. It plans. Grace Whitfield came to my hospital room on day 6 with a manila envelope and an expression I could not read. "I need to show you something," she said. "And I need you to understand that what I am about to tell you changes the shape of this entire case." She opened the envelope and placed a photograph on the bed. A wedding photo. Not mine, Daniel's. I stared at it. A younger Daniel, maybe 35, standing beside a woman in a simple white dress. The woman was blonde, with an academic look about her. Glasses, a serious face. A slight smile that suggested she was more comfortable with books than with cameras. She looked. I realized with a chill that started at the base of my spine and worked its way up. A little like me. "Daniel Harrington was married before," Grace said. 7 years ago. A woman named Diane Carver. The marriage lasted 14 months. Diane filed for divorce citing financial fraud. Specifically, forged loan documents using her identity without her knowledge. I could not breathe. The air in the room was there, but my lungs were not cooperating. I heard the words, but they came from very far away. like a radio playing in another room. The charges were dropped. Grace continued. The case disappeared. Diane Carver moved to Portland and has not given a public statement about Daniel Harrington since. I looked at Grace and I said, William knew. It was not a question. Grace paused. Just a fraction of a second. But I saw it. William became aware of the first marriage 3 years ago. She said carefully, 3 years ago. When Daniel and I had been married for 1 year, William had known for 3 years that his son had done this before. To another woman, the same method, the same forgeries, the same careful, calculated dismantling. And he had said nothing. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger at William. Not exactly. Something more complicated than anger. A rearranging of the picture I had been building. William's arrival at the hospital. His honesty. His help. All of it was real. But it was also, I understood now, motivated by something more than kindness. It was motivated by guilt. By the knowledge that he had watched his son do this before and had looked away. And that his looking away had allowed it to happen again. To me, why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because Diane Carver has agreed to testify, Grace said. She has been watching your case in the news. She called my office yesterday morning. And just like that, the shape of everything changed. We did not have an incident anymore. We had a pattern. Daniel had not made a mistake with me. He had refined a method. He had practiced on Diane Carver, learned what worked and what did not, adjusted his approach, and applied the improved version to me. The isolation was more thorough. The forgeries were more sophisticated. The exit strategy was more elaborate. I was not his first victim. I was his second draft. Diane's testimony went before the judge in a pretrial hearing 2 days later. It was devastating, precise. She described the same techniques in such specific detail that even Grace, who had heard the stories before, sat very still throughout. The gradual isolation from friends and family, the subtle undermining of confidence, the financial manipulation, the forged documents, and most critically, the psychiatric narrative. Diane told the court that Daniel had attempted to have her declared mentally incompetent during their divorce proceedings. He had hired a psychologist, different from Dr. Moore, but using the same method, to create a paper trail suggesting that Diane was emotionally unstable and that her accusations of fraud were the product of paranoid delusion. The judge's face throughout was unreadable, which Grace told me was a good sign. Daniel's legal team immediately filed a counterclaim. They argued that Diane's testimony was orchestrated, that William had paid Diane to come forward, that the entire case, the forensic analysis, the account freeze, the security footage, everything, was a coordinated attack by William Harrington to seize Daniel's company and transfer it to his own control. William called me that night. His voice was different, careful in a way it had not been before. They are framing both of us, he said quietly. And Claire, some people will believe it. I am a powerful man who benefits financially from my son's destruction. That narrative exists whether it is true or not. I sat in the dark of my hospital room and thought about how a story can be true and still be made to look like something else entirely. How evidence can be real and still be framed as fabrication. How the truth, without power behind it, is just a version competing with other versions. What do we do? I asked. William was quiet for a moment. We make sure your voice is the one people hear, he said. Not mine, not Grace's, yours. The judge agreed to hear from me directly, in my hospital room. It was an informal proceeding. A court reporter sat in the corner with her small machine. Daniel's attorney, a man named Richard Avery, appeared via video on a screen placed at the foot of my bed. Grace sat beside me. I had spent the previous night thinking about what Sandra had said. The next 3 feet. My 3 feet were simple. Tell the truth, in my own words, without apology. Richard Avery opened by suggesting, gently, in the polished tone of a man who charged $400 an hour to make good people feel small, that my testimony might be colored by the emotional volatility common in high-risk pregnancies. The judge, a woman named Patricia Ellison, who had been on the bench for 20 years, looked at the screen over her reading glasses and said, Mr. Avery, you have 30 seconds to ask a substantive question or I am moving on. I almost smiled. Then it was my turn. I did not perform grief. I did not cry strategically. I did not arrange my face into the expression of a sympathetic victim. I had spent 4 years arranging my face for someone else's benefit and I was done with it. I just said what happened. Specifically, chronologically, with dates. I described the fundraiser, the courtship, the wedding, the isolation, the reshaping. I described how Daniel had removed every support system, every friendship, every financial resource, every piece of independent identity until I existed entirely within a structure he controlled. I described the pregnancy, Savannah's visit, the forged prenup, the $900,000 of debt in my name. The psychiatric evaluation conducted without my knowledge or consent. I spoke for 45 minutes. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not ask for sympathy. And then I said this: Your Honor, I have been asked several times in the past week why I did not leave sooner, why I did not see the signs. I have been asked it in a way that suggests the answer should embarrass me. It does not. I did not leave because I was carefully and deliberately prevented from having the resources, the relationships, or the self-perception that would have made leaving feel possible. That is not a character flaw. That is a system. And I am asking this court to recognize that the system existed and that it was deliberate, because there is a woman in Portland named Diane Carver who can confirm that it was not built for me. It was built before me. I was just the next one. The room was quiet for a long time after I finished. Judge Ellison sat very still. She looked at me, not with pity, not with sympathy, but with the focused attention of a person who is weighing something carefully. Then she said, "Motion for emergency visitation. Denied. Motion to introduce the psychiatric evaluation. Denied pending verification of methodology. We will reconvene in 2 weeks." She stood. Then she paused. "Mrs. Harrington, I have presided over a great many difficult cases. What I just heard was not a woman in crisis. It was a woman who has done her homework. She left." Grace squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. "My daughter was born on a Tuesday at 4:23 in the morning. 12 hours of labor. Sandra on one side, Carol the nurse on the other. William waited in the hall. He had not asked to be there. He had just shown up and sat quietly, the way he had been showing up for weeks, present without presumption. I found I did not mind. When they placed her on my chest, red-faced and furious and perfect, I said her name out loud for the first time. Eleanor, after my grandmother, the most stubborn woman I have ever known, a woman who raised 3 children during the Depression and never once, not once, let any of them believe they were anything less than enough. Eleanor screamed, a full-throated, indignant scream that filled the room and drowned out the monitors and the machines and the noise of everything that had happened in the months before. I laughed. Sandra cried. Carol smiled and said, "There she is. She has been waiting for you." I held my daughter against my chest and I felt her breathing, small and fast and fierce. And I thought, you are the reason I survived all of it. Not because you needed me to be strong, because you needed me to be honest. And I could not be honest for you while I was still lying to myself. 3 days after Eleanor was born, Daniel's attorney contacted Grace. He would accept the settlement. Full custody to me. Supervised visitation contingent on a psychological evaluation of Daniel. $22,000 is monthly in child support. All fraud charges to result in a guilty plea. No NDA. Diane Carver's testimony, combined with William's forensic audit, Savannah's cooperation, and the handwriting analysis, had made the trial unwinnable for Daniel. His own legal team had told him so. Even Richard Avery, $400 an hour, polished confidence, expert at making good people feel small, had looked at the accumulated evidence and told his client that going to trial was not a gamble. It was a certainty of loss. Daniel's message came through his attorney. Not a call, not a letter, not a handwritten note or a visit or even a voicemail. An email, 3 sentences. Settlement accepted. I wish Eleanor well. This is finished. He could not even say her name in the sentence about her. I wish Eleanor well. Not I wish my daughter well. Not I love her. Eleanor. His daughter. Reduced to a name in a 3-sentence email drafted by a lawyer. I read it. I put the phone down. I fed my daughter. And I felt, for the first time in 4 years, like the floor beneath me was solid. I want to tell you the truth about what came after. Not the beautiful version. Not the inspirational montage of a woman rebuilding her life set to uplifting music. The real version, because the real version is messy and complicated and sometimes ugly. And it matters more than the clean one. The first 6 months were hard in ways I had not predicted. Not legally. Legally, we had won. The settlement was signed. The charges were filed. The system, for once, had worked. The hard part was everything else. The nights when Eleanor would not sleep and I was alone in the small house William had helped me find. A 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing like the estate I had lived in with Daniel. And the silence would settle around me like water rising and I would think, very clearly, I made every wrong choice. Every single one. From the moment I said yes to Daniel Harrington at that fundraiser, I chose wrong. Those thoughts are liars, by the way, but they are very convincing liars. They speak in your own voice, and they know your weaknesses. And they show up at 3 in the morning when your defenses are lowest and your baby is crying, and the house is too quiet and too empty, and you cannot remember the last time someone touched you with kindness. And then there were the reflexes. The apology reflex. I would catch myself starting to apologize. to my mother, to Carol, to the checkout woman at the grocery store, to strangers on the street, for existing in their space, for taking up room, for having needs, for being present. 4 years of being taught that my existence was an inconvenience had wired that apology into my nervous system, and undoing it took longer than I expected. Therapy helped. A woman named Dr. Reeves, who had a small office with too many plants and a way of asking questions that made me think rather than react. She never told me what to feel. She just kept asking me what I actually felt, underneath the performance, underneath the habit, and then she waited while I figured it out. Some mornings I would sit in her office and not say anything for 20 minutes. She would let me. That patience, that willingness to let silence exist without rushing to fill it, was one of the most healing things I experienced. Sandra moved in for 3 months. She slept on the pull-out sofa in the living room and made terrible coffee and left her reading glasses in every room and sang off key while she did dishes and drove me absolutely crazy. And I have never been more grateful for anything in my entire life. She was there at 3 in the morning when the thoughts came. She was there at 6 when Eleanor woke up. She was there at noon when I needed to cry, and at 3 in the afternoon when I needed to laugh, and at 8 in the evening when I needed someone to sit beside me on the couch and watch terrible television without talking. She never asked me to perform gratitude. She never made me feel like a burden. She just was there, the way good mothers are there, like gravity, constant and invisible and essential. I went back to teaching. Not 6th grade this time. I teach adult education at the community college now. Women returning to work after long absences. People starting over. People who have been away from classrooms and careers and independent lives for years, sometimes decades, and are trying to find their footing again. I understand them in a way I did not before. When a woman sits in the back row on her first day and keeps her arms crossed and does not make eye contact, I know what that posture means. It means she does not trust the room yet. It means she has been in rooms that hurt her, and she is waiting to find out if this one will too. I give her time. I give her space. I do not push. And eventually, usually around the 3rd or 4th week, she uncrosses her arms. She raises her hand. She asks a question. That moment. That specific moment when a person decides to take up space again. That is why I teach. Diane Carver and I exchange emails. She lives in Portland with her daughter. She is doing well. Better than well. She started a small business, a consulting firm that helps women navigate financial systems after divorce, understanding credit, rebuilding savings, protecting their identities. She is good at it in the way that people who have survived something are good at helping others survive the same thing. We have talked about starting something together. A foundation, a resource, a place where women navigating exactly what we navigated can find information and support and, most importantly, the knowledge that they are not alone, that what happened to them has happened before, that there is a pattern, and the pattern can be recognized. And recognition is the first step toward getting out. We have not launched it yet, but we will. William comes to dinner once a month. He brings wine and sometimes flowers, and he sits at my kitchen table, which is nothing like the dining table in his estate. And he eats whatever I have cooked, and he plays with Eleanor on the floor afterward. He is different than I expected. Now that I am not seeing him through Daniel's description, he is quieter, funnier. He has a dry sense of humor that catches you off guard. He adores Eleanor with an unguarded openness that I think surprises him, as if he did not know he was capable of that kind of love and is still getting used to the discovery. Last month, Eleanor pulled herself up on the coffee table and looked at him with the most serious expression I have ever seen on a 14-month-old. Just stared at him, evaluating, considering, making up her mind about this large, quiet man who kept appearing in her living room. William laughed until he cried. That is what 4 years of careful planning and systematic dismantling did not take from me. It could not take Eleanor. It could not take Sandra. It could not take the version of me that exists in this small house with the mismatched furniture I chose myself, the books on the shelves that I picked out, the pictures on the walls that I hung where I wanted them. Daniel's company was liquidated. He pleaded guilty to fraud. His sentence was suspended. 2 years probation, financial restitution, mandatory compliance program. He lives quietly now. I do not know the details and I do not seek them. He has not requested visitation. 8 months after the settlement, I received an email from Daniel. Subject line, an apology. I sat with it for 3 days before I opened it. It was long, carefully written. It acknowledged what he had done, not in vague terms, but specifically, the forgeries, the isolation, Savannah, Diane, the psychiatric evaluation he had commissioned. He used the word calculated. He said he had been in therapy, that he was beginning to understand the extent of what he was. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said he knew he did not deserve it. He asked only one thing, that someday, when Eleanor was older, I would let her decide whether she wanted a relationship with him, that I would not decide for her. I read it 4 times. I wrote back 2 sentences. That will be Eleanor's choice when she is old enough to make it. I will not stand in the way of that. I hit send, and then I felt nothing dramatic. No triumph, no grief, no closure in the movie ending sense. With the swelling music and the slow motion walk into the sunset. Just quiet. Just the sound of Eleanor in the next room, babbling at the mobile above her crib. Just the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of a life that is mine. I spent a long time believing that strength looked like never breaking. Like the strong people were the ones who absorbed every blow and kept standing. Who never cracked, never faltered, never showed the fractures. I admired those people from the wreckage of my own collapsed life, and I thought, I am not like them. I am broken. I failed the test. I do not believe that anymore. Strength does not look like never breaking. Strength looks like breaking, and getting up, and breaking again, and getting up again, and one day realizing you have been standing for a while, solid and steady and whole, and you just did not notice when it happened. There was no single moment of triumph, no dramatic turning point, just the accumulation of 1,000 tiny choices to keep going, to keep trying, to keep believing that the version of yourself you lost was still somewhere inside you, waiting to come back. She was. She always was. Someday Eleanor may want to know her father. That will be her choice to make when she is old enough to make it with full information. I will not make it for her. I will not poison it for her either. I will simply tell her the truth, in age-appropriate pieces. For as long as she keeps asking, that is all any of us can do. Tell the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. Even when it would be easier to perform a prettier version. The truth, told honestly and without apology, is the strongest foundation I know. If something in this story felt familiar to you, if you recognize something in the gradual isolation, or the careful reshaping, or the way evidence of a problem got reframed as your instability, I want you to know that recognition is information. Do not talk yourself out of it. Do not rationalize it. Do not explain it away with excuses about stress or pregnancy or sensitivity. Trust the recognition. It is trying to save you. If you are in something right now and you do not know how to start getting out, remember what Sandra told me. The next 3 feet, not the whole plan, not the whole escape, not the rest of your life figured out and organized and certain. Just the next 3 things you need to do. That is enough. That is always enough. And if you are standing on the other side of something, the way I am standing now, in a small house with mismatched furniture and a daughter who screams at the world with the same fury she had the moment she was born. If you have made it through and you are still here, still breathing, still choosing to get up every morning and try again, I want you to know something that took me a long time to learn. You are not too far in to get out. You are not too broken to rebuild. And you are never, not for one single day, as alone as they want you to believe. I will be here next week with another story. Until then, stay in your own corner. It is the strongest place you can be.